One of the reasons I personally like the idea of literature mapping is I think we tend to read a lot. I mean, it's a nature of being a postgraduate student. We spend so much time reading, actually trying to remember or understand or think through how everything links to each other is a huge challenge. You might at the end of the session say, hey, Craig, literature mapping feels like I have to do an extra step of work. And the truth is, you do. You cannot escape that. But that one extra little step is actually designed to help you think through and solve some of the other things where you're sitting there for ages thinking, how does this relate to this? And what else did I forget? So even though it appears to be an extra step in our thinking processes or in our note-taking or writing processes, however you want to do it, what it effectively is doing is it's helping us to get a more comprehensive understanding of how everything that we've read fits in everywhere else. And you'll get that in the coming minutes as I sort of talk about it. But the whole idea and why I am, I guess, an advocate of the idea of literature mapping is at the end of the day, once you get into the idea, it actually makes life. It makes understanding all that reading so much easier. And the best part of it being easier is when you start writing out, especially when you do your literature review chapter, or perhaps when you're converting something into a journal article, it actually makes it easier for you to pick and choose the literature and the relationships between the different pieces of literature so that you can write about it. So to me, it just makes life so much easier. Tonight, I've got three objectives, and these are really to understand the concept of mapping as it applies to our curation of literature reviews themselves. Hey, Farrell, can you let the couple of people that are in the waiting room in, please? So we want to just understand in terms of the literature review, but believe me, this works for anything else in terms of trying to prepare for a conference paper, trying to prepare for anything, for a journal article or so forth. So it becomes a valuable skill. I want to appreciate how the map can be a planning tool when it comes to finalizing our literature review prior to dissertation submission. Now, this one's where the value comes for us. Let's say when we've written our proposal, we've read 100 articles. I'm not saying that's a good or a bad number, be it as it is, but we've read 100 articles and we've got a grasp on how things fit together. We've got a grasp on the development of that area of the discipline. We've got a grasp on the, how to put it, we've got a grasp on the development of the methodology, for example. But you know what happens? We've written our proposal, we've read our 100. Every day we are still reading. And every day we read something new and it gives us a different insight or it gives us a different thought. What do? We rush to our literature review chapter and we try to plug it in. We try to write a sentence or we try to find a way that we can add to it and keep it going and all of that. But at the end of the day, that's really hard to track. So what I see is, look, the literature map gives us a chance to visualize how things fit together as we read them, rather than reactively writing every couple of days. Oh, I read this, I've got to add this in. Actually, we just deal with it on a literature map first. And then every so often, like every couple of months, we come back and we say, these are the new things. This is where I can fit it in. And it actually makes rewriting and editing our particular chapter, it actually makes it much easier than that. I also want, for the third objective, is to take a practical look at how we can adapt and adopt literature mapping in a dynamic format to work for us. So at the end of the day, we want to create a tool that's going to help us become better at doing our dissertation. So let's start off with the first objective. What is mapping in the context of a literature review? And, you know, this is going to be the boring theory part for a few minutes. But really, you know, I consider it an element of an annotated bibliography, and I link it into mapping. And it seems like extra work. Just as I said, actually, yeah, it is. Now, if we start with an annotated bibliography, that brings together a record of every resource we have. It provides our personal reflections, and it also provides, if you've done it right, or you've done it my way, whatever, it also provides an indication of what the potential contribution to your dissertation is going to be. Because as you're sort of taking some notes, you know what? This is going to help me with my methodology section, or this contributes to my understanding of the research gap, or this disproves something else, so I have to be able to showcase it. So I've got all these reflections on how I'm going to use it. Mapping simply gives us a visual tool to showcase this, whether it be the important players, the concepts, the ideas we identify, and it gives us a way to cluster these according to themes, according to patterns, according to chronological development. When we write our literature review, we tend to try and do it thematically. I mean, different styles, okay, but we tend to try and do it thematically, or we tend to try and do it chronologically. But sometimes there's also going to be overlap between those, and we've got to find a way of how do things not only correlate and develop, but how do they match with other areas that we're talking about? For example, if I have an article that not only showcases latest research and the key points that we must consider, but it also helps, helps in the evolution of our choice of research methodology, then in fact, it's going to filter in a couple of places in our literature review. The mapping helps us understand that, but it also helps remind us that actually this particular piece of literature, i.e. this journal article or this particular work, actually plays multiple roles in our dissertation. Now that to me is helping my memory, because I'm going to forget it sometimes. I'm going to like, oh yeah, that was good. Selby 2023, perfect here. And I'm going to forget it had other elements that were important. So a literature map, and I'm going to share with you many examples, because it's not about following my way of doing it. It's about creating your own way. But a literature map is very much like a mind map. So it's just a tool. And it's also a development and sharing tool. So one of the things that I feel are very useful once you decide, you know what, literature mapping is for me, this is the style I want to use. Literature mapping is also a way that you can visually showcase progress and relationships with your advisors. So as you're talking to them about how things fit together, as you're talking to them about what you've discovered more recently and so forth, actually what you've got is something that you can bring along, say, you know, this is how I view where everything is at the moment. And this is where I see opportunities, or this is where, you know, I see the trajectory going. So rather than, I want to say, forcing your supervisor or advisors to read something, you can actually give them a very good visual summary and use it as a discussion point. Now, literature mapping's not new. It's been thought of for quite an amount of time, and we're talking over 25 years. It's a graphic blueprint, it's a diagrammatic representation, it's a geographical metaphor. I don't want to get into the um, philosophical elements of it being a geographical metaphor, though, that is kind of interesting. But it's really quite simple. And these quotes kind of help me think through really what it does or what its use is. So maps provide tangible evidence of a student's understanding and interpretation of the research, which can be shared with peers and supervisors. Talked about that. It's simply just showcasing, actually, you see how all the dots join together. And to me, that's valuable. That's not so valuable as far as I'm concerned for your supervisor. That's valuable for you. And being able to do it really makes it easier. The shift to another modality, and that's where we go from text, i.e. writing, taking notes, to visual. Whether that be sort of a giant whiteboard or one of the softwares that do everything, or like I do, post-it notes on the refrigerator. The shift helps create patterns in the field. So you see things that are otherwise hidden. It identifies the gaps, the boundaries. Um, to me, it's a different way of thinking. You're thinking about the same stuff, but because you're mapping it, you're actually thinking about it differently. So when you see the relationship between things, it may invite more questions. And when it invites more questions, that's where you get to think. That's where you get to say, these are my potential solutions or so forth. More importantly, it translates to the structure of the literature. And I should say, it translates to the structure of the literature review. Helps us to identify where to put things today, as I'm writing now, but also tomorrow when the additional contributions are added. And that's really, as I said before, this is why I like the concept of literature mapping, because it gives me like a photograph of how what I've read today fits together. But as I change, as I see more things, as I add to it, or as I understand how different things between other articles fit in, then it gives me a better detailed understanding. It's like building a house, and we start with scaffolding. We build up the scaffolding, we build a frame, and then we start putting pieces into it. That's actually what literature mapping's doing, but it enables us to make the house bigger every time we do it. Now, the approaches to mapping are kind of important, and this is something, not that we have to follow what you see on the screen here, okay? But it's decisions that we have to make for ourselves. And as researchers, we've got to be able to say, why am I spending this slightly extra time? What are the key things that I am looking for as part of this process? So it's not only going to be an organizational tool, but it's a reflexive one. Now, reflexive and reflective are similar but different. Reflexive is about us understanding and being aware of our growth as researchers. It's not the whole PhD process. It's not just let's learn something, write a book, and be called doctor. It's actually about looking at ourselves, our understandings, how we process knowledge, how we think about it, the barriers, all of this. It becomes a fantastic tool that we can look back and say, you know what? I understand things differently now, or I've changed my perspective, or I see how other perspectives fit into the equation now. So that becomes really valuable. it requires an understanding of the mapping process itself. Now, in a few minutes, I'm going to show you a whole lot of maps. I probably won't do maps like this because I'm old school. I take the Post-it labels and I take a whiteboard and I'm sort of popping them up because that works for my brain. Other people are really comfortable with using technology and, having electronic relationships. That also means you can link it back to maybe a database that you're using of articles that you've read. So if you're using something like Zotero or EndNote or something like that, you can be totally modern and totally up to date with technology and have it all linked in. Very cool, not a problem. Just find the process that works for you. And something that you have to do then as well as we move into it is you need to make explicit what your personal mapping methodology is. So it's choosing a way, choosing a style of map that you want, and this is where the next part comes in, but choosing a style of map and choosing the key focal elements, the key focal points of it, and using that to be able to guide how you construct your map. Now, I'm going to argue there's no right or wrong here, but there are ways to make it better. And as you sort of get into it and you see how it's working for you, you're probably going to refine or change the level of detail that you want. And this is the same with just a simple annotated bibliography. The more we read and the more we think, the more we can reflect on it and say, you know what, this has this value, this has this important point, or this has a relationship here. So we get better at it over time, but it doesn't mean we throw away or eliminate the older one. What we do is we start figuring out, and this is reflexive here, we start figuring out, how can I update myself on this? Now, the key thing, first thing, distinguish between declarative knowledge and procedural knowledge. So declarative knowledge is identifying concepts, ideas, methods. So this is what it is. Procedural knowledge is what are we going to do with it in terms of classifying our concepts, forming the links, or understanding the relationships. Now, each map, there should be an element of both. We want to understand the key concepts and how they evolved over time, for example, or the key methods and how these have evolved over time. And we can put it out and sort of draw a diagram or an infographic based on that. But the procedural knowledge becomes actually, how do things link together? And at what point are we, as doctoral researchers or academic researchers, going to use them? The quote here is, preparation for making a visual map, we ask doctoral researchers to talk about their difficulties in selecting and categorizing bodies of research. The thing that is going to be a challenge, okay, when we're reading, forget about mapping, just when we're reading, it's understanding what each literature or piece of literature, each article, each chapter, each report that we are reading is contributing to us. And it's also understanding some pieces of literature can actually contribute in multiple ways rather than just one. Some pieces of literature contribute in a theoretical or conceptual construct, whereas some pieces of literature actually give us examples or anecdotes which help us to be able to compare, contrast, and to share what we've got. When we come down to methodology, some pieces, will help us understand how the methodology has evolved over time. Some pieces will help us to explain why previous methodology has failed. So we've got a lot of things to put into what we're doing, and we've got to figure out, which is going to be which, and then how we're going to write it. Now, a map actually enables us to cluster all of these things together and see what their contribution is going to be. Now, before I move into diagrams, I promise you'll see some examples of maps shortly, okay? But let's just go with some basic advice. And this is some of the approaches to mapping. And this is from Coverdale. I think at the end, if I'm not mistaken, I've got a couple of references for you guys. If not, I will find them and put them on our social media in the next day. Machi and McEvoy, that person, presented two mapping strategies. One is by core ideas or descriptors. So that becomes your keywords in your research topic. Now, if you're mapping by descriptions, keywords, that actually gives you, clusters. And you'll see very shortly what I mean by that. But that will help you cluster all the like things together. So whether it's methods, whether it's theoretical constructs, whether it's opportunities, whether it's mistakes in research, or areas where other academics have said, look, there's an opportunity. The second one is mapping by author, which helps you identify who are the key experts, and also then looking at the use of quotations, or how you might be able to look for key authors and use quotations from them in terms of your referencing and citing others. Now, this one's different because it has a different set of values. If I choose to focus on who my key authors are, I'm letting their work guide the trajectory. I'm not always convinced that in my field, for example, the key or the most prolific authors are in fact the best, because in many cases, the people who write lots and lots of papers are the people who come from big universities who have money and can afford it. And we may be limiting or excluding quality research from other people from other parts of the world that don't have access to major publishing houses or don't have the money to publish in top-tier journals and so forth. Now, that's kind of a political thing. But at the end of the day, I want to showcase through my literature review, not only that I know who the big names are in the field, but I want to showcase that I understand the contributions that other researchers are making as well. So if we map by author, there is a chance we kind of marginalize some of the others whose research is absolutely fantastic. So that to me is a consideration. It's not a roadblock. It doesn't mean I'm not going to do it this way. In actual fact, I like the idea of doing both. I like to map by ideas because I want to see development. I want to see opportunities. And I want to take authors out of that idea. They're not the first criterion. I want to see the concepts. I want to see the evolution. And then I want to do a second map, which is mapping by author, in which I can identify who are the key people leading this, because those are the people that I'm also going to want to, data mine their reference lists and so forth. But as it says here, it's also the use of appropriate quotations, because clearly they are at the forefront, so we have to consider them. But by having both, the first one gives me a broader understanding, a more refined picture. The second one helps me identify the key players so that I can also make sure that the ideas are not deviating too much. Or if they are deviating, I can reference back and see, is there something they've missed out? Now, these maps can then be subdivided. And you can appreciate, I'm talking a lot. You haven't seen a graphic yet, but I promise in a minute. But the maps can be subdivided by theories, definitions, chronology, cross-referencing. You as a researcher, if you decide, I like the literature mapping idea, you as a researcher have now got the opportunity to say, this is the way I want to do it. Now, there are a few types of maps, and you're going to see examples of all of these in subsequent slides. A feature map gives argumental structures developed from summaries, so it's really just the key elements in a progress. You have a subject tree map, which shows the development of the topic into sub-themes, into levels. You have a content map, which is kind of a linear structure, almost like an organization chart, but just sort of maps it down and puts it across, and you get to slot in the different researchers or the different articles that go in there. You have a taxonomic map, which gives classification through typical taxonomies that are used within, or categories that are used within your discipline. And you have a concept map, which is about linking concepts and processes. To me, I hate talking about these because I'm never going to say to a PhD candidate, let's do a taxonomic map of what we've got. That's not how my brain is going to work. I'm going to have elements of several of these in any that I do. So it becomes important to think that through. Now I'm going to get into the samples. And I wanted to give you samples. I've got quite a few different samples here, just to showcase how we look at it in different ways. So this is just a simple example of a literature map. And what you'll see is 4 key areas that they're focusing on. And then under each of these, it's breaking it into sub-themes that have been there. So if we look at scenario planning, for example, and only now I'm going to regret that because I teach scenario planning. But let's look at scenario planning. We have methods. And what we're doing from top left, moving across methods, is we're looking at each of the authors. Now, I would want to go a bit deeper. I would want to say for each of those 3 authors, for example, what have they contributed to my understanding of methods? What have they focused on in ways to develop scenario planning or futures planning for whatever organization or whatever scenario you're looking at? But what it's really doing is saying, look, in this particular topic, we have 4 key things: scenario planning, participatory design, social innovation, history. Let's look at each contributor in those. Some are dealing with alternate futures, some are dealing with methods. Some are dealing with case studies, some are dealing with wicked problems being huge, complicated scenarios that require a little bit more than just a questionnaire or an interview or a bit of statistical analysis. The interrelationships get bigger. What I have here, though, is with this map, I know where each of my authors fit in. Now, some of my authors fit in a couple of times. So if you look under social innovation, for example, you can see all the dotted lines. They take me between history and participatory design. And that really says, you know what? Although this author, this article is mostly a case study under social innovation, it's also related to participatory design, and it also has an impact in history under Rust Belt in this case. Now, not my diagram, so I'm not really going to go into that. But it does help showcase where the major contribution is, but it also helps showcase the relationship. The advantage for me is, imagine I'm asked to put together a short presentation about the current state of literature. And this is only what, maybe 20 articles, so easy for us, right? I'm asked to put together a short presentation on the current state of literature. I'm able to start with the independent. I'm able to identify the researcher and their contribution and the focal point, which is methods under scenario planning or diffusion under social innovation. And then I'm also able, as I progress, to say, now there's a linkage to this. And it kind of becomes a checklist for my writing, because I can tick off that under participatory design, for example, I've got Kurtz 2006. Then I've got a subsection on methods, and I've talked about, I think, Schultz, I can't read that, Schultz or Buxton and Buxton, and I've included that. It gives me a writing framework. When I go then into my next section and I do social innovation, and I talk about case studies and I go through those four, I've also got a visual reminder that says this has an indirect or important relationship to the concepts discussed in participatory design. So I've got a visual reminder of how things come together. Now, this is one example. This is not exactly how I do it, but it kind of does form a framework. For me, I'm likely to take it in a number of different ways. I'm definitely going to have a section on methods. I'm definitely going to have a section on theoretical development. I'm definitely going to have a section on case studies. And then I'm going to hang those off each of that to see. But as I hang off, I'm also going to have a chronological part, so almost multi-dimensional. So under my methods, not only am I talking about who the key players are, who the key authors are, I'm going to map out the chronological time by time, old to new, development of how the methods have worked. And under that, I'm going to have the challenges, or I'm going to have the lessons learned, and so forth. So there is going to be more to it. This is a different one. In this example, what they've tried to do is actually a very typical marketing technique. And sometimes in order to understand something in the marketing discipline, we simply do a very simple double continuum. And we sort of put opposing things at two ends of a continuum, and then we develop it further, and we see the relationship between how things are going to be. So, for example, I'm doing some research on AI in higher education, and I could look at the universities who adopt AI successfully and allow AI in research, and I can look at universities at the other end of the scale that don't. I can then look at, say, for example, number of publications or frequency of publications or ranking of publications from high to low, for example. I can start mapping out different things that are important. Now, this one just helps us see where different writers or different authors are in a bigger picture. The thing is, this is not going to work for a whole thesis. This is going to work for subsections at a time. So, for example, I'm looking at a particular school of thought. I may be looking at understanding multiple theories of thought, schools of thought, for example. I might be, looking at understanding multiple time frames. I'm going to take piece by piece and map it out, because that helps me understand the position of somebody related to someone else or related to a different piece of research. So this example doesn't give us something that helps us understand everything we're reading. What it gives us is a subsection. But each time I do this, and each of these maps that I create like this give me a section in my literature review. They give me an understanding of an element of where my problem is. And ultimately, each little map I have like this might give me 2 or 3 pages in my literature review, and I build them, I stack them. If you want to be intelligently smart and perhaps a bit over the top, you can do it as one giant thing and map them all out on the same thing. But that becomes complex. That doesn't help you. So a small where I can break down something. And it might be, let's say I'm looking at the history of methodology for my research problem, and I'm looking at qualitative versus quantitative. I'm looking at community involvement versus standing back from this. I can map that out and get a good answer. Then I can move on. Now, if I do it a different way, or I want to think of some other things, what can I also get from that? So I might have one for data collection. I might have one for data analysis. It gives us new ways to visually see something. This is a more hierarchical literature map. And this is kind of the ones that I like because it enables me to break up into a few things, put down my authors, and you'll see the authors are listed individually. Now, here's where I like to do it differently. I think this is the structure. I would get out my Post-it notes, you know, the sticky labels, and I would have this framework on a whiteboard. And every time I read something, my sticky label would not only give me Hofstadter 1984 or 2005 under culture, it would actually give me, or I'd have a note to the point that I want. In my case, I'd have a number and it would relate back to my annotated bibliography where I have my reflections. Now, every time I read something more and I add to it, I can add more and more of my sticky labels under my structure with my references, with my notes. But it also means I can come back and say, you know what, Hofstadter 1984 has now been disproven by Selby 2024. Therefore, I take Hofstadter 1984 out of the picture because I don't want to write about it, knowing that it's already been disproved or knowing that its contribution is no longer considered acceptable. So when I use a map like this and I use the sticky note approach to it, I'm not only adding, I'm taking away. If I later discover that, you know, some of the different elements here break up or it becomes more clarified, I can then take some of my sticky notes, move them to a slightly different location, give them a different categorization, and so forth. But it gives me, again, a visual representation of how things fit together. What I personally like about this is, and again, the sticky notes idea for me, but electronically works as well. What I like about this is it gives me a chance to question. So I'm putting up a visual idea of how the different things fit together. But I also then get the chance to take a different color sticky note, put it somewhere and say, actually, what is the relationship between Hofstadter 1984 and Marcus 2000, for example? So I get to ask myself questions. I have a visual reminder that says, you know what, Craig? You've looked at this, you've understood the hierarchy, the structure, you've understood some relationships. Now you have a question, remember to answer it, because it's your responsibility in your literature review to do your best to address any question that you have. So in that case, you know, you've got something there that helps you to further develop. Now that's the reflexive thing from before, because as I'm asking questions, as I'm developing, either the new things that I read and add to my list, add to my map, answer those questions for me. Oh, you know, this one has answered that question. I take away my question because I've now got the answer. Or I come to the end of it and I say, there's still an unanswered question. Does that give me an opportunity for future research? Or is this a conversation I need to have with my supervisor? Or should I be reading something else? Now, when I say, should I be reading something else, I then go and I look. And if you remember back here, I talk about mapping by author. So when I come to that situation that there's something missing, it also gives me a chance to say, well, who actually are the key authors here? And lo and behold, on the left-hand side, Hofstadter turns up in so many places. But that also says, okay, I need to go and see what else Hofstadter has written. Have I missed something? Or has somebody evolved what Hofstadter did? So it gives me these subtle reminders that, there are gaps, there are questions, but it then helps me go back and say, you know what, these are the key people writing. They're the likely first port of call to help me understand what I'm missing from that. Now, here's a slightly more elaborate literature map. And this is looking at proportions and different things, because if you look at it, you look at the circles in the center, the color, the size of the circle is certainly designed to highlight importance, but it simply does exactly what this one has done. It gives me a relationship with the key concepts. So in here, if I look from psychology to the left, we have halo effect, beauty, beauty debate, aesthetics, first impressions. It gives me my subsequent structures. It gives me the key concepts that come about with things that I'm talking about. It gives me my key authors, but it also allows me to show who came first, who led to something else, and are they related to other areas of the same thing that we're talking about. Now, to me, this is not a topic in terms of whatever's in this literature map. This is not a topic I understand, so I don't want to go too deep, but it does give me another way of mapping it out. The examples I'm using here are not the world's most complicated literature maps. So I don't have something that has 300 entries into it. And I don't think you necessarily want to have that either. But what I'm hoping it does is it just showcases how you can visualize the reading and the contribution from each reading so that you can then map it out. And then you can say, well, I'm going to write a section of my literature review about this. So maybe, for example, I'm choosing games and virtual reality. What it does tell me is these are the people I must include. These are the key facts or the key findings that I must include. So it helps you bring it together. Then you've got the opportunity to do it according to time and so forth. Now, we have other types of mapping too, and citation mapping is one. You'll see this comes through a lot. This is not something I'm particularly skilled at, so I really don't want to spend a lot of time on it. But really, this is actually looking at a chronological history of who cited what and when. To me, I'm probably not going to do citation mapping for anything that I do because that's going to require some technology and that's not me. What I am going to try and do is find a bibliometric-based publication that actually does citation mapping in my field. So I've now got a lot of the work done for me, and then I can sort of go through and make my choosing or my structures a little bit better. Journals are publishing bibliometric articles now. That actually does make our life easier because it helps us see who the popular people are. What it doesn't do is give us access to everybody. It gives us access to those who are making an impact on the usual structures. We need to see the full set of research as well. Now, I want to move on to the relationship with writing, because we've talked a bit about this, but I sort of want to emphasize it. Maps become an excellent tool for developing the outline of your literature review document. However, a good concept map that looks nice may not produce a good literature review. You're still got to understand what's in the map, but the map should help you develop your outline. It is a lower level of detail than the writing that you need. So it's not a substitute for it. I think of it as a discussion document to get me started. Now, I actually like the concept of verbal mapping. So suggesting the mapping process, or actually the process of describing it, can influence the writing composition. So this gives us the key players, the overlaps, etc. What I personally think works is, look, I build up a very simple literature map. I use this to take to my supervisor or my collaborators. And I use that as a discussion point where I can outline or I can explain how things have linked together. The map gives us a reminder. Actually, it still comes down to our understanding of everything that's in those articles and our ability to articulate them and explain them. For me, when I want to write something, I speak it first. Once I've spoken it, I can write it down. I have a structure. I can see how it works. So verbal mapping, or being able to take the overview, the map that you make, present it, even if you're just talking to the mirror or talking to yourself on Zoom, presenting it actually helps you articulate the structure of how you would write it, because the ideas in there need explanation. Speaking to that enables you to do that. So to me, everything about the map creates a flow, it creates a structure, it creates a checklist for you. So every time you write something, you tick off on your map, is it in my literature review, or is it in my document? And if at the end something is not checked off, you then get to say, did I forget it? Was it not important? Or this must be included there. So it gives you that checks and balances as well. It's never going to give you the text of your literature review, but it's going to give you a pathway to think it through. And it's going to help you manage all those extra things that, you read and you keep adding on from day to day. Now, this is probably redundant for many of us. There are plenty of great software out there that will enable us to use technology to do it. You just have to work with what works for you. I'm not here to advocate the one on the right-hand side, which is very much how I would do it, because that works for me only, and it may not work for you. The advantage of using technology with literature mapping is you can directly link it to PDF downloads. You can link it directly to the DOI reference of every article that you've got. You can build a database that not only gives you the article itself, it gives you your annotated bibliography, references to it, but it enables you to quickly create a visual like is up here, that shows how everything fits together. So it gives you a very deep, or potentially deep, database. By hand, you're not going to get that. So unless you're old school like me and are quite happy to go through hundreds and hundreds of, articles and piles and pages of notes, tech might be better. But work with what works for you. Now I want to get into the practical side before I go for a Q&A element to this. When we look at annotated bibliographies, we number each annotation, we date it, we date revisions, and we date the rethinks. I believe when we are doing our literature map, we should practice the same thing. Every time I update my literature map, the area that I update, I should date it. I should make a reference to the fact that it's a revision or it's a rethink. That's the reflexive element of what we're doing or what we've got. We can look at key sections. So whether we're using matrix structure, we can look at citations, which is going to be our things that go, including, research questions, hypotheses, all of this. We can have a personal reaction. All of these are what we might put into an annotated bibliography. And an annotated bibliography is probably going to say, well, this is going to fit into chapter 2 or chapter 3. The whole mapping process is doing exactly the same thing, but focusing on one area. So it might be focusing on the methodology, or it might be focusing on theories and so forth. So we do have all of this in the traditional annotated bibliography, but we need to bring it into that. Now, again, I'm going to come back to my old school method, the whiteboard, the post-it labels, because to get started, we need something that's going to be really flexible that we can move around. And that's what I love so much about this is, taking those post-it labels off, moving them somewhere else, shifting them around without ever losing them. And it really enables us to build structures, strands, and multiple maps. And structures and strands are like, well, I'm doing a theoretical, I'm doing the development of the schools of thought, or I'm doing, the conceptual framework, and that becomes one map, or I'm doing the evolution of methodology to solve this problem. So I'm taking an element at a time that I'm creating a map with. And probably you might need a few whiteboards or big pieces of paper that you can fold up. The post-it labels mean I can keep changing my mind. As my knowledge gets updated, I move something or I add to it. I can add different contributors in terms of different articles, which also means it's going to help me. Sometimes we read older articles, and I think you guys know really well we're not encouraging articles that are more than 10 years old to be cited. And certainly, not too many if you have to. By keeping a sort of a map out of who else is contributing, it also gives you the chance to say, you know what, I want to highlight this element is important. Oh, these 3 are within the last 5 years. Those are the ones that are most likely wanting to cite. So it actually helps you in choosing what you're going to cite or who you're going to cite. It gives us a build as we read. The thing that I hate the most is every time I read something, I've got a new piece of information. I've got to think about something differently. And it might challenge me. So as I read something, I keep putting it up onto my literature map. That gives me an evolution. It then gives me that chance. I'm adding in, I'm taking out. It gives me the opportunity to take out things that no longer serve me. It gives me the opportunity to put in anything new as I go along. Now, to me, it's memorializing or snapshots. So every so often, I'm going to take a photo of my literature map. Yeah, old school, I know, but I'm going to take a photo of my literature map because I might come back to an earlier way of thinking about it. I may need to go back to it. It's an evolving visual. It's not something that's always going to be the same. It's going to grow. It's good to have a record of how it's grown over time, because that also gives us an opportunity for us as researchers, to see how we've grown. And that, again, I cannot emphasize enough, it's so much an important part of our journey. Drafting chapter 2 based on our evolving map. So chapter 2 is the literature review. We can draft a framework even though it is incomplete. That doesn't mean it's going to be a fantastic chapter, but it is going to give us a framework. It enables us to edit it every so often. I don't like the idea of having to edit a chapter every time we find something new. That's just insane. So it's something we can say, you know what, every 3 months, I'm going to check back on my literature map. And I'm going to check back, I'm going to say, I see where the new parts are. I want to restructure my chapter. And then I'm going to go all out and write it. And then when I come towards the end of the entire dissertation process, I'm going to have a final literature map that says, this is how this discipline has evolved. These are the facets of it. These are the key players. These are the chronological or time by time evolutions that have happened. Now I'm going to make sure my literature review chapter or any other chapter, because trust me, this is going to fit into chapter 3 in research methodology as well. And it's going to have an element in chapter 1 too. But I'm going to be able to look and say, now my final product that I'm submitting has got to be a nice, tight, textual representation of what is up on my whiteboard or what is up in my chosen literature map. So it gives us that opportunity to really do a really strong final edit and make sure the two correlate. But it also gives us a better way to say, is the structure how I've written my chapter? Is that the clearest way I can do? If I look at the map, it seems so much easier. Oh, let me try and redevelop it according to that. Now, that's kind of it for this presentation.